Hello and welcome to the Running Mates podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Comstock, and today we're going to discuss the recent primaries that happened across the country and what they mean for the midterm elections in November. Later, I'll be sitting down with my good friend Chris Sandbach to discuss a specific race that happened here in Georgia that I think showcases the current state of play in the nation. First, we're going to give a quick update on the war in Iran and the Strait of Hormuz. Since the war with Iran started on February 28th and ended for the first time with a ceasefire on April 8th, the United States and Israel has been in essentially a stalemate with Iran and its allies Yemen and Hezbollah. There's been a lot of noise and a lot of nonsense that's been coming mostly from the Trump administration to try and spin the current conflict and crisis into something that he can call a win. There have been multiple ceasefires, multiple negotiations and deals that are almost settled and negotiations that are almost finalized, but it's all mostly come to nothing. And really, there's just been so much every day that comes out that it's hard to distinguish the signal from the noise. And what I mean by that is the most important thing to know about the conflict as it currently states is that the Strait of Hormuz is still closed. It's been closed for just over 100 days now. And aside from a few ships that have slipped past the blockade, it has effectively been sealed. Everything else is secondary to that for the world economy. So in the last 100 days, the United States and other countries around the world have been draining their petroleum reserves of crude oil to make up the difference in what has been lost by what would normally come out of the Strait. As well, the Trump administration and specifically Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent have been working overtime to control and manipulate the oil markets and the stock market to prevent a crisis of confidence over this conflict. With all of this effort, oil prices have risen, but not dramatically, not as dramatically as many people forecasted at first. Currently, the market and many commentators on this issue think that eventually something will break or something will finally force Donald Trump to give in to the requests that Iran has made in order to end the conflict and open up the Strait. Right now, a lot of the things that have softened the impact on the global economy and what you yourself may be experiencing at the gas pump is being softened by the United States opening up its strategic petroleum reserve. Currently, the Strategic Petroleum Reserve in the United States is being drained by 1 million barrels per day, or thereabout. This fills in a gap of about 1 million barrels of oil per day that would normally go through the Strait of Hormuz. The reserve, as of now, has about 350 million barrels of oil within it, and we are currently draining it by 7 million barrels per week. So far, so good, it would sound. By that measure, we should have 35 more weeks to drain this reserve before we start feeling the big impact of the oil crisis, right? While that may seem intuitively correct, all this is going to do is make any coming energy crisis more acute later on. Instead of allowing prices to rise in accordance with the lack of supply, the United States is draining its reserves extremely rapidly to maintain the current functioning of the economy. It's sort of like saying you can't pay your bills with the money that you make at your job, so you're going to finance your lifestyle with your credit cards to make up the difference. Essentially, what that just means is kicking the can down the road to make it even more painful if and when something breaks. So I still think the global economy and the stock market and the oil commodities market can't beat the law of physics and the laws of gravity here. So after 100 days, we have over about 1 billion barrels of oil that are just missing from the market. We will see the effects of this sooner or later as people compete and pay more money for oil and petroleum products and refined products for their purposes. Each day that the Strait is closed is another day closer to something breaking, and we don't really know what that could be. Something like this has been planned for and thought of and talked about endlessly, but it's never actually happened. So oftentimes when there is a crisis, it usually comes out of nowhere, because if it's something people can prepare for, they'll prepare for it. It's always the unexpected that really leads to a big problem. Furthermore, each day that the Strait is closed is essentially a victory for Iran. It's one more day that they have control over the Strait, they have control over the territory of Iran, and they can make bigger and bolder claims or requests of the United States, because it's only going to get worse and worse for us. This global energy system is incredibly complex. It starts with oil in the ground and it ends with many things, from gasoline in your car, jet fuel in the airplanes that you might fly on, plastic material in the goods that you buy, nitrogen based fertilizers that grow the foods that we eat. Many, many other things are all interconnected here. And with this important route cut, we don't know what the full effects are going to be. Only time will tell what happens. But as the news reports of meetings and negotiations and all of the tweets that we're close to a deal, we think a deal will be reached over the weekend, there'll be more discussions of like tweets that are saying, we're currently shooting at each other, we're bombing each other, but this doesn't count as a violation to the ceasefire. Negotiations are ongoing. The more that happens, it's just more noise in the system. All that matters here is that the Strait of Hormuz is still closed, and the longer it is closed, the better a situation it will be for Iran. Now, my own thinking here is when Trump finally agrees to give Iran whatever it wants in exchange for opening the Strait of Hormuz, what if we're not pricing in, or what if we're not thinking that what Iran wants is revenge on the United States for attacking it out of the blue? To quote an old movie, what if they aren't interested in our money? What if we don't have enough money to pay them off? And I think this is the scenario that a lot of commentators on this issue are not addressing and are unable to address. I mean, that's a no-win situation, but that is what anyone would have told you before attacking Iran, that this is what was going to happen and that it was a no-win situation. Only time will tell, as I said. Only time will tell how this is going to play out, but I imagine regardless of all the talk and the continuing conflict in Israel and Lebanon, I think the Strait will remain closed at least until the fall of this year, perhaps longer. The Iranians also know that the United States is having a big election in the fall, and they're very famous for timing their strategic decisions based on when it would have maximum political impact on the leadership of the United States. So, for example, with the Iran hostage crisis, where the Iranian regime held hostage embassy workers for over 2 years in 1980, they released the American embassy hostages on the day that Ronald Reagan was inaugurated, on the very last day of Jimmy Carter's presidency, January 20th, 1980. So I expect something similar like this may happen to Donald Trump. Now, on to the elections. Over the past 3 weeks, we've had a slate of primary elections in several states that are an excellent gauge. They're better than any poll of the current political climate in the country. The big ticket races that are worth paying attention to here are in Kentucky, Texas, Georgia, and California. And the results here, I think, showcase the general mood and trends over the country. The big takeaways here, there's one for the Republicans and one for the Democrats, really showcases two things. Number one, the last primary shows that there is no Republican Party without Donald Trump. So this was called Trump's revenge primary, and there's really no room for any Republican, no matter how close they are to the Make America Great Again movement or to an America First thinking. If they are not 100% with Donald Trump, then they're on the outs. So no non-Trump MAGA adjacent lane exists, and it may have existed in the past. You could see that there was a moderate wing of the Republican Party, perhaps even as far back as 2012 or 2016. That has withered away. And now there really isn't even a hard right wing of the party. It is purely MAGA, purely Donald Trump. So for people like Marjorie Taylor Greene, Lauren Boebert, Tucker Carlson, and in this case, Thomas Massie or Rand Paul, who can exist within that far right lane, if they're not pro-Trump in that lane, it's not enough for them to hold on to their seat. So putting this in another way, the MAGA ship is sinking, and Donald Trump remains the undisputed king of the part of the ship that's still above water. And this is because non-MAGA Republicans, either moderate Republicans, Mitt Romney Republicans, or the America First Republicans, they simply are not showing up to the polls. I believe this is due to the worsening economy. These are voters who are voting on their pocketbook. They were swayed by Donald Trump's argument that he was better for the economy in 2024, and that our argument just doesn't hold up anymore. And rather than vote for an alternative, they are just not showing up for the party that they would normally show up for. And what does this mean for the Republicans? So usually when a party wins a presidential election, the midterms 2 years later are bad for that party. I believe this will be a historically bad midterm for the Republican Party in 2026. It seems more than likely that they are going to lose both the House and the Senate, and ultimately no amount of gerrymandering that the states do to prevent that from happening is going to be able to stop the big wave that is currently coming. So to expand on this further, Trump's revenge primary and the withering of the hard right of the Republican Party, I think you need to look at Kentucky to see a really good example of this. So in Kentucky, the Kentucky 4th Congressional District, Thomas Massie, a libertarian candidate, or a libertarian congressman, was defeated by Ed Galbraith, a first-time candidate. So Massie, like Rand Paul, he's not really a Trump Republican. He's a libertarian. So he's not some squishy liberal, but he's also not 100% in line with Donald Trump. And more importantly, he was a big backer of the Epstein Files Transparency Act, which seemed to be the real reason why Donald Trump wanted him removed. So a record-breaking amount of money, outside money, was spent on this race in Kentucky, over $40 million to unseat Thomas Massie, and he was ultimately defeated. So that's the story that you'll see in the news, that Donald Trump has like total control over the party, and that Massie, who was very popular, still lost, and that all of this money was spent in Kentucky. But what is being glossed over, however, is that Massie lost that race by 10,000 votes. So Ed Galbraith generated 57,000 votes. Thomas Massie generated 47,000 votes, and about 100,000 people voted in total. But for reference, in the Kentucky 4th Congressional District, there's 200,000 registered Republicans, so double the number of people who actually voted, and 600,000 total registered voters. So turnout was relatively low in this election, and that's despite having $40 million worth of advertisements and communications put out on behalf of this election. So while Trump is controlling the party, a majority of the party, fewer people are just showing up, and you can't say that they're showing up because they aren't aware of the race or they aren't aware of the issues. So that's the takeaway for the Republican Party. The takeaway for the Democratic Party is that Dem voters are turning out. They are energetic and they're very angry, but they're also sick of politics, or they're tuned out of the niche issues and nuances within the party primary as of right now. You might even call them, uncharitably, uninformed voters. They seem to be most invested into the big ticket issues facing our country and not about the smaller and even local issues that might affect them. The best example I can think of for this is here in Georgia. So in Georgia, Keisha Lance Bottoms, the former mayor of Atlanta, won overwhelmingly in this primary and beat out a slate of pretty competitive candidates who were vying to face her in a runoff election. So it seems like from the results, Keisha won on name recognition. She had the endorsement of Joe Biden and raised a lot of money and won over a large mass of voters who, for them, that was enough. Her opponents seemed to split the voting bloc of both the progressive wing of the party, progressive voters, as well as what I would like to say are the hyper-informed voters, people who are voting for candidates based on their niche issue. Here in Atlanta, that may be housing or transportation or education policy. The people who were voting wanted to vote for a Democrat and wanted to vote for the Democrat that they knew was going to, quote unquote, fight for them. So the takeaway being the people who won with the most name recognition ended up winning these races, ended up winning this race in Georgia and similar races around the country. So similarly, we see the same thing in the California governor's race. So in the California governor's race, you had Javier Becerra, who took over as front runner after Eric Swalwell had to step down due to the sex scandal. And he consolidated support of the Democratic Party machine in California and big institutional supporters who gave him money and credibility. He ended up defeating the Republican, Steve Hilton, who is always going to come in second. It's a big state. But more importantly, he defeated the more progressive candidates in that race. So while Becerra was able to consolidate support among the centrist wing of the party, the progressive wing was fractured. You had Katie Porter, who ran essentially as a spoiler to Tom Steyer, who were both trying to carve out a large enough chunk of progressive voters to run against Becerra in the general and make the general election a centrist versus progressive race. Instead, it is going to be a Democrat versus Republican race. So Becerra ensures a status quo within the state of California and does not have to promise some of the big things that the progressives were hoping for. Big structural problems like infrastructure and housing in California are going to remain essentially unaddressed. They'll continue with the current policies in California for the foreseeable future. So again, California, just like Georgia, shows that Democrat voters are turning out. They're excited to vote against Donald Trump and the Republican Party, and the more minutiae in the Democratic primary doesn't seem to interest them. So in California, it's not really about, are we going to repeal Proposition 13 and affect property taxes? Are we going to try and build high-speed rail? Are we going to try and build more affordable housing? It is more like, what can we do to destroy the Republican Party and Donald Trump? And I think that's an important snapshot of the dynamic in 2026. The Republicans are very weak, but that does not necessarily mean that Democrats are therefore strong. Strong individual candidates with their own confident voice continue to outperform their opponents, and the Democrat Party itself has sort of confused messaging and I would say no voice as a party itself. That said, people who are voting for Democrats are angry and inspired and will show up. Moving on to other states and other important races. Maine, and the Maine Senate race seems to be getting a lot of attention in the news media. It seems, despite all of the ink that is going to be spilled and hemming and hawing about Graham Plattner, it seems that Mainers have already made a choice for him and that they like him despite his rough edges. He's the Democrat candidate with a lot of momentum, a lot of money, and a high profile, even if all of the attention he's getting isn't all that good. It seems like, according to polling, he's pretty likely to win, even though his opponent, Susan Collins, is pretty famous for overperforming her polling numbers. But Susan Collins is elderly now, and Graham Plattner has built quite a sizable lead in most polling. And then finally, rounding things out in Texas. So in Texas, the sitting incumbent Republican Senator, John Cornyn, who had a very high profile within the Senate, was defeated by Ken Paxton, the Attorney General of Texas. This was another case of Donald Trump's revenge primary. Cornyn was very likely to win this election in November, but was not going to win this primary because Donald Trump didn't like him and endorsed anybody who would run against him. So Ken Paxton, the Attorney General, is an incredibly weak candidate and has not been getting enough attention, but I believe he will as we get closer to November. He's a very sordid history, all sorts of charges of corruption against him. And if you've seen any videos of him, he's not a very charismatic or even competent public speaker. And he certainly can't raise any money compared to his opponent, James Tallarico. So he's objectively a worse choice for the Republican Party. He's a worse choice for Donald Trump, but Donald Trump's pettiness won't let him do the right thing. That primary, again, showcases the same dynamic in Kentucky. The only people who showed up were Trump's most ardent supporters, and that the moderate Republicans who maybe are now independents, simply didn't show up. And it seems likely that they're not going to show up in November. So the question everyone is now asking is, could a blue Texas be in the cards? Most polling organizations and commentators on it are hedging and are pretty cautious. They want to say it is a toss-up or it is a lean Republican. But I think currently the Democrat, James Tallarico, has a better than even shot at winning that race. I think he's going to win it. James Tallarico is actually leading Ken Paxton in many of the polls. And if you look at previous races where we thought this could happen, like Beto O'Rourke in 2018, Beto never led once. He only tied in some of the polls that were conducted. So if Tallarico is currently leading right now, that's a really great sign for him. I think the same people who say that, Texas would never elect a Democrat are the same ones who probably thought that Donald Trump would never attack Iran and that gasoline wouldn't cost $6.50 in Texas. I think it is really incumbent on Tallarico, in order to win this race, to really attack his opponent very strongly. I think he needs to hit Paxton hard and not let up from today all the way through November. And unfortunately, I think he needs to sling as much mud as possible on a very deserving target. So I think that pretty much sums up the current dynamic and the lessons learned from the recent primary elections and concludes our Hormuz and election roundup. After the break, I'll be sitting down with my good friend Chris Sandbach to discuss an important but little noticed race here in Georgia and what it means for the bigger picture of politics in 2026. Okay, welcome listeners. I'm here with my good friend Chris Sandbach, and we're here to discuss the recent primary elections and what it means in November of this year for the midterms. Chris, it's good to see you. How are you doing today?
I'm good. It's good to be here. Thanks for having me.
For the listeners, Chris, can you tell me a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, Chris Sandbach. I've lived in Georgia my whole life, originally from Valdosta. Ended up going to college in Savannah and was there for 7 years before I moved to Atlanta for law school. I was a public defender for about 7 years after law school, and now I do civil litigation, criminal defense, and some civil rights work as well. I'm also chair of Regulate Democrats, which is a political action committee that is specifically focused on fundraising to support candidates in the Georgia state legislature.
Now, your time in law school and as a public defender here in Georgia must have been pretty eye-opening. Or how has that informed your life and your politics?
I mean, I think it's probably the most important thing that I've ever done. I wouldn't trade being a public defender for anything. You know, you don't make any money and you're in your 30s and still have a roommate, but it was, you know, an incredible experience. You're working, you're having to deal with like people on the ground, you know what I mean? And so you're having to solve the problems that we come up with new policies to solve. And even it often can be broken down into not a partisan thing. It's just like, you know, when you're dealing with like homeless folks or people with mental health issues, you know, you'll find whoever you can to help you deal with it, you know. But it definitely has had a massive effect on how I view like district attorneys and judges and how impossible it is to educate an electorate on who at least at a state court level judicial race, not like the Court of Appeals, but you can be a lawyer, and if you haven't practiced with or in front of someone, whether it's in front of a judge or with a attorney who's running for a district attorney position, you have no idea how they're going to do their job. Because I've seen Democrats running for DA who may have had really good intentions, but because they were not equipped or didn't manage the office in a logistics way, they did more harm than a Republican who was maybe not like invested in like holistic like solutions to the criminal justice system, but they knew how to efficiently run an office.
Yeah, you might not agree with their principles or their beliefs, but they could run a very competent office. We're about to get into this, but I bet the most recent results for the non-partisan Georgia Supreme Court judges must have lit your hair on fire with the unfortunate results for Jen Jordan and Miracle Rankin.
Yeah, it was really disappointing. I mean, it's probably the biggest. I don't remember the numbers for 2024 as far as like the gap, but $250K difference for Jen Jordan, who is a fantastic attorney and a really wonderful person, is a pretty bad loss considering all the progress we've made over the last 10 years.
Yeah. As someone who's worked with this system and with your experience, what would you say generally the state of like the judicial system is in Georgia? We're going to get to these results of this Georgia Supreme Court race, but by and large, one of the common issues for why the two Democrats, Miracle Rankin and Jen Jordan, both lost is they lost to incumbent judges. And many people, when they go into the voting booth, usually they'll know who's at the top of the ticket. They know there's like a Senate race or someone running for governor, but then this is now on like page 2 or page 3 of the ballot. and they don't know who is in charge or what their values are. So, and on top of that, these races as well can be nonpartisan, and that can also work against the average voter. So from this like 10,000 foot view, what do you think the state of the judicial system is? How are the judges in general? How much variance or variation is there?
Well, I mean, I think it's important to clarify, they're judges that you deal with on a kind of a day-to-day basis, like in traffic court or superior court or state court, whatever. And then there's the race that you just mentioned for Court of Appeals, which is, very different types of courts. They're not presiding over any trials. They're determining legal issues. That's really all they do. It's very important because, they're the people that are going to have constitutional issues under their auspice, whether it's a Fourth Amendment, privacy issue, which, I mean, I think that's going to become more and more important every day with, AI and cameras. I mean, I think Atlanta is one of the most watched cities in the country. And, whether you think that's a good thing or a bad thing, I think it's important to acknowledge that it's happening. But yeah, I mean, Court of Appeals is tricky. I interned there in law school for the clerk, not actually for a judge. I worked generally for the court. Georgia appellate level judges, whether it's Supreme Court or Court of Appeals, they get less attention than, the Supreme Court of the United States.
So, I mean, in a similar vein, I've seen a lot of conspiracy theories, I should say, doomers online, especially talking about this Supreme Court race, specifically in the context of Brian Kemp is trying to do a mid-cycle redistricting to gerrymander the state further.
Right.
And then there's this idea he's going to try and maintain a Republican grip on power. And then there's an added conspiracy of trying to invalidate absentee ballots in the midterms or doing some other kind of legal maneuver to invalidate Democrat votes in 2026 or 2028. And this idea that we needed those Supreme Court seats because it would go to the Georgia Supreme Court before the Supreme Court. Do you put any merit in that, or do you think there are other things that could get in the way that could mix that up? Do you think there's a concerted effort there?
I don't think that's a conspiracy theory. I think it's happening right now. I'm pretty sure that these maps wouldn't be able to take effect for 2026. I think it would have to. But obviously it'll have an effect on 2028. I mean, there's a myriad of issues with the elections in Georgia. I mean, too many to name. Honestly, you've got this redistricting issue. You've got the Fulton County 2020 votes that were seized a while back, which is wild.
Yeah, whatever happened with that? Tulsi Gabbard was supposedly behind that seizure. I guess it would be subpoenaing, but she's now not in the administration. I mean, that was a big scary bump in the night, but we didn't see any fallout from that.
I mean, some of the conjecture I heard from people that are much smarter than I am. The concern was focused on not that it was going to be an immediate consequence. It's going to be, down the road, because these ballots were audited multiple times in 2020. There was not, we know there was not an issue.
That, yeah.
That's not up for debate. But I think the fact that what you just said is important. We haven't heard anything else about it. I think that's the point. They'll put it in their pocket, and then if something doesn't go their way, they'll be like, well, we found this, but we're not ever going to, obviously, one, they didn't, and two, they're not going to be able to show, they're just going to say, and we're going to have to rely on, the very shaky foundations of truth that they
live their whole lives on these days.
But I think it's definitely going to happen. And then also, I mean, I guess they are calling a special session, so I'm assuming this issue will be resolved then. But a couple years ago, within the Republican craziness, they pushed this bill through that would get rid of the QR codes on ballots. Okay, whatever. I mean, is it maybe the most efficient thing to do? No, but whatever. I mean, doing paper ballots is a perfectly viable way to run elections. It's not, there's no real huge issue with that. But the deadline for them to do that is a month from now. So they passed a bill requiring that. But in the 2 years since that bill passed, they haven't done any of the logistical work to be able to do it. So what I mean by that is their ballot marking devices and election infrastructure doesn't have a system to replace the one that already exists. And since the law that was passed requires them to get rid of the QR codes on the ballots, technically, if it doesn't happen by July, or if something isn't passed that kicks it down the road further, we're open to lawsuits.
Interesting. Because I noticed when I voted in the primary, it is so locked down. To give you an idea of what it's like to vote in Georgia these days, in person at least, you are showing a government ID. They give you a little key card that you put into a voting machine with like a RFID chip in it. You make the selections on the screen. You hit, these are my votes. It then prints out physical paper copies of a paper copy of your ballot with a QR code on it. You then go over to, you take your paper ballot over to like this stand, and it's like this big locked garbage can, like this humongous garbage can fax machine, and you run it through. You both give your RFID card to one of the attendants. You also run your paper ballot through, and then there's a little counter that counts your ballot is in there. And it's also like locked with 2 different bits of tape and a padlock. It seems like there just is redundant measures to ensure that there is no problem. And there wasn't a problem before, but it's like, just to be really clear that we have counted double, triple times, 2 or 3 times what these ballots were. And then that's what they're auditing at the other end of this, right? Like, that is what then people are saying, oh, well, maybe we're not sure, so we're going to look at these paper ballots. Yeah. So, but does that count? So I remember there was a QR code on these documents. Can they just remove the QR code from that and keep the same?
I think it's more complicated.
It's more complicated.
And I mean, there's a lot of people that want to get rid of the funny thing is, it's been a long time now, but one of the reasons we have these ballot marking devices, or you can call them B&Ds, but that is because of the 2000 election. You remember the hanging chad and everything. So that's why a lot of look, I can't speak for every state, but I believe got to be most states have moved to these, digital, screens, and they work really well.
Yeah.
I've supervised every election since 2018.
And you still are, we didn't mention at the beginning, you still are a part of the Georgia voter protection legal team here. You work in the boiler room, and you are fielding phone calls from people who are having issues voting. You're still a part of this larger team to ensure that our elections
for the state Democratic Party. Yeah.
For the state Democratic Party, that elections are still running smoothly, that no one's rights are being taken from them.
No, most 2020 was crazy, but no, generally the issues that will usually come up are like somebody didn't check their registration before they went, and so they went to the race, stuff like that. And so, it still matters because we want everybody who wants to vote to be able to vote, and we don't want it to be too difficult for them. And so when that sort of issue comes up, we're trying to make sure, basically there's a poll watcher on the ground watching what's happening at a poll site. And if that were to happen, which it happens every day,
all the time,
might call us and tell us. But what we would be interested in is, did the poll worker, not the poll watcher, the person who's employed by the county to work that polling site, or one of them, provides the correct instructions to the voter who is at the wrong polling site. And most of the time, certain areas are more raise issues more than others, but generally these people really care about what they're doing, and are, do a good job, That's why you saw, even when all this stuff was happening, whether it be, the issue that I just talked about with the ballots being changed, the elections officials, like, for instance, Douglas County has a election supervisor, and he's very experienced in he knows what he's doing. But many people, his name's Milton, but a lot of people like him spoke out, against them not calling a special session to kick this down the road, because it's going to cause lots of problems for them. So, no, but our elections are safe. The complaint would be that we make it more difficult than we need to for people to vote. There's little complaints. Like, I personally think it would be better if the BMD cases where you vote, the flaps on the side that are supposed to provide some sort of privacy.
Yeah.
I think I would appreciate it if they were a bit larger, like the old squares, provided a bit more privacy. I honestly don't care if anyone sees who I vote, but I'm sure there's situations where people really value that privacy. Yeah. And they should be afforded it.
I can speak for myself. If I go and vote with my wife, we're like usually right next to each other. So she certainly could, it might be technically against the rules, but like there's really nothing stopping her from like
Yeah.
looking over my shoulder or me looking over hers. So that is kind of an issue if you really think about it.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, I think it's been something that's raised, but it's also like with everything going on surrounding elections, particularly in this state, you got to pick your battles. You know what I mean? That's not the priority over making sure that, you know, all these other issues we discussed. I mean, the scary stuff is, and that, yeah, I mean, we have seen that. I know I said a minute ago that, you know, we don't see, but it's not exactly true. I mean, in 2024, you know, at about between 9 and 10 a.m., I didn't supervise Fulton. I had Southeast Metro, so I had the cab and kind of over. But Fulton County had bomb threats at multiple polling sites at between 9 and 10 in the morning, which is a heavy voting,
Really heavy
time. And then DeKalb County had 7 concurrent bomb threats, you know, at about 6 or 7. And here's the thing. They handled it the way they were supposed to, and they shut them down to make sure people were safe. The Georgia Secretary of State was already able to determine that these threats were from Russia, or they were Russian based.
Really?
Yeah.
I didn't know that. Yeah. I knew that there were bomb threats. I remember there was a big one in Cherokee County and then a few down in Valdosta. I did not realize that they actually found the culprit was foreign.
I don't know if they like were able to tie it to a specific person, but I know that and again, this is a Republican Secretary of State at Raffensperger. They did report that it was a Russian based attack. I mean, and then we had the shooter in Cobb County just a few weeks ago. Yeah. I mean, so that's obviously, it was a mess. And I remember the 2024 DeKalb issue, they shut all the polling sites down, which is what they're supposed to do. And then we prepared motions to move the magistrate judge to
extend the hours.
Most of the time, we don't have to fight for that.
Yeah, that's
but we have to be prepared to, because you never know. You know what I mean? Particularly if it's in one of these counties. I mean, Coffee County, we don't have to get into that rabbit hole, but they're uniquely problematic. And I mean, so problematic that we have a special like group of people that specifically deal with Coffee County.
With Coffee County.
Wow. But like, we don't touch that during early vote. Anyways, that happened, and I don't think we had to fight too hard to get the hours extended. But, you know, look, normal, you and I would probably wait around or come back and vote. But most people they don't have time to sit there and wait an hour for the safety check. You know what I mean? And I'm not saying that was the deciding factor in the results of the 2024 election, but it absolutely prevented people from voting.
Yeah. No matter what, there's going to be some slippage.
And we don't want that. You know what I mean? It's not a good thing.
Well, moving on from that, we have a lot of things to worry about, to be concerned about, but let's go through the results of the latest primary here in Georgia. So just a couple of top line numbers and setting the stage. About 2 million people voted, breaks another record for total number primary turnout. And about 1 million people selected a Democrat ballot, 1,001,000 thereabout, and about 900,000 people selected a Republican ballot. So we have a 100,000 Democrat lead just in pure ballot selection. Only about 15,000 people selected an independent ballot. From that, the headline results or the news-making results are, again, John Ossoff was essentially unopposed. He's the Democratic nominee for Senate. Keisha Lance Bottoms, former mayor of Atlanta, won outright, which many people were predicting would go to a runoff, but there is no runoff. She won by almost double the number of votes as the second place candidate, Jason Estevez, for governor. And then what the Georgia Democrats were hoping for was to pull off a win with this judges race for the Georgia Court of Appeals to replace 2 incumbent judges who were appointed by Brian Kemp with 2, you could say, Democrat or liberal, more liberal-minded judges, Miracle Rankin and Jen Jordan, neither of whom were able to unseat the incumbent, and also had a huge discrepancy between votes for Miracle Rankin. 250,000 more people voted for Miracle Rankin than did Jen Jordan, though neither unseated their opponent. And this is seen by the politics watchers as something of an embarrassment because, number one, more Democrats voted than Republicans. So ipso facto, you would expect them to win. Number two, the discrepancy for a variety of reasons. Maybe it's the incumbency bias. Maybe it's something to do with like the names of the candidates. Number three, it was a very expensive race. So Miracle and Jen both, they campaigned together. Essentially, they were endorsed by Barack Obama. They spent about $8 million to try and put themselves out there. Both were defeated. So based on all of that, it seems to me like we had really strong Democratic turnout, but very low information voters. Voters who did not know necessarily the issues or were not aware of the races themselves. What's your take on what's going on in Georgia?
I think that I think it's probably impossible to expect for lack of a better term, normie voters to be relatively well educated on statewide judicial races. That being said, I am glad that they spent the money on the ads and pushing that race because it is important. And I think despite me thinking it's very wildly unlikely that most people are going to pay attention to that sort of race, I still think we should try. You know what I mean? The results kind of speak for themselves, in that I think you're seeing a lot of Dems are motivated to vote for Black candidates and women candidates. And there's nothing wrong with that at all. In fact, most of the time, that's probably the best way to go. But unfortunately, in this case, it didn't end up helping Jen Jordan's race, obviously. So, yeah, I mean,
and also important, Jen Jordan was, I believe, officially running against Sarah Warren. So it was male, female, and female. So that also could.
Yeah.
The response that I think, again, a lot of people were hoping for is that in November of 2025, an equally obscure race to the common person, the Georgia Public Service Commission, the PSC race, ended up being this bright spot where for the first time in 30 years, Democrats in this partisan race won against the Republicans. But you have sort of a similar issue, no? Where you'd say, well, most people don't really know what the PSC is or how it affects them. What are the differences you see there? Why could the Georgia Dems do it in November, but they couldn't do it in May?
And you may have to correct me on this one, but my recollection is the PSC races were really the only things happening.
Was the only thing happening. That is correct.
It's a little different. Also, if you're in Georgia and you voted 2 weeks ago, you know how long that ballot was. It was a long ballot. And so when you get to judges, people may just be, I don't know.
Yeah, or leaving them blank entirely.
I mean, there was a ton of Fulton County. I live in Fulton County, and there were a ton of just magistrate and superior court judges up for election. Most of them unopposed, things like that. But it's just, it was disappointing. I was pretty irritated about the JQC coming out and the Judicial Ethics Watchdog state organization that's supposed to govern judicial professionalism, for that basically the best way to describe it, and kind of admonished both candidates for the race for endorsing each other. Look, if it's against the judicial rules of professionalism, fair enough. My problem is, where are you for every other judge in the state that does BS every day? I mean, in my 10 years of practicing, my experience with them is they are pretty
biased,
useless. I don't think that the types of people that they actually reprimand, admonish, hold accountable are there. It has to be something huge. So for them to do something, comment publicly a date just 3 days or 4 days before the election on something minor like this, it's motivated by
partisan politics. Yeah, I mean, it seems like there's a larger structural problem here of that. You want these judgeships. Any judgeship is meant to be nonpartisan, or it should be, and you expect that, or you would hope that kind of non-partiality to it. But then at the same time, because it affects our lives so much, you can't really escape it. I saw a similar thing. I don't know if it was from that ethics committee where people were admonishing the Miracle and Jen for running on saying that they were pro-choice and their opponents were pro-life. And, that is an issue that is a legal, ethical issue that splits along partisan lines. It becomes a partisan issue, but you can't have it both ways. You can't say, well, we're not allowed to talk about that, but we're allowed to rule on that. We're allowed to be involved in those questions.
I mean, typically if you've watched Senate confirmation hearings of, they don't like to say, I would rule this way because, it's like, it's just not appropriate until they have the case in front of them. But again, we know, you know what I mean? It's one of those things where it's like, it happens regardless. But.
So you don't believe them when when the Supreme Court candidates are being grilled by the Senate and they say they just call balls and strikes and they've never thought about this issue or that issue beforehand?
I mean, I don't think I know those sorts of hearings are often for, show and performance, but I don't like that, the performative thing. It just kind of rubs me the wrong way, even from our side. Like that does not swiddle on party lines. We're as guilty of performative measures as anybody else in politics. But I don't love that. So, I mean, for instance, pick a conservative Supreme Court justice. You just need to look at their resume. We know who they are. You know what I mean? You'll get surprised sometimes. I mean, like Gorsuch had a really wonderful decision on an Indians' right case out in Oklahoma, and basically returned like a massive portion of Oklahoma back to one of the Indian nations. And that was kind of a surprise.
Yeah. Well, now I know you said, you already said you don't have the right answer for how we can get people educated on these important issues for like these judge races. But I guess we don't have to come up with a solution that'll work right now. But just in general, what do you think needs to be made the priority? Is it more now? Could it be, because I was thinking about this and it's like, I have 3 buckets, right? Is it persuasion? Is it education? Is it turnout? And not, those things aren't mutually exclusive, but like if you were the DPG or you're in a position to run these kinds of campaigns, where do you put your priorities as a legal professional who speaks to and deals with a lot of non-legal professionals?
Yeah, I think turnout has to be number one priority, because I mean, I think we've shown when people turn out, we win. You know what I mean? There's more of us than there are of them, which is why they're resorting to all these games. Or that's not pejorative enough to describe what they're doing. But these schemes, whether it's redistricting or, during 2020 when they kind of like tried to elevate mistrust in absentee ballots and vote by mail and things like that, because they know if you make it easier to vote, more people are going to vote, and more people voting is not good for them. I mean, I don't think there's any data or information that says otherwise.
Yeah.
That doesn't mean that's going to solve the issue that we were talking about with like a race like these judicial candidates. But I think that turnout has to be number one priority, because it solves a lot of problems. You know what I mean? And it's not expensive. That's one of the more simple things that we can do and we should be doing. And I think we are, based on how many people, more people vote in Georgia every year. So it's exciting. I think we definitely could have and should have done better in that bucket for those 2 judicial races. The people I talked to had a lot of big questions for the state party after we were able to see the results. And so I wonder if.
Now, what kind of questions I had to ask? What kind of issues were?
Well, they wanted, I mean, again, okay, so like you brought it up when we first started talking, how big of a difference there was between how many people voted for Miracle versus Jim. Okay. I mean, that's a problem. And I'm not employed by the DPG, but I hope powers that be over there are looking into a solution, because it's something that needs to be addressed. Because again, it's a tough race, but like you said, $8 million spent on those races. That's a lot for a judicial race. That's a lot for appellate court. Yeah, that's a lot. How was that money spent? Well, was it used to do? I mean, I didn't see that many ads. I know that they spent money. They did a big ad buy. I know that.
Yeah.
I didn't see it. All I get is Rick Jackson.
Yeah, he did flood the zone, which also could be.
Oh, and it worked for him.
It totally worked for him.
Nobody knew who he was before November, December.
It confirms all the like horrible stereotypes about Republican voters, because his ads are
It was bad.
real dumb and real simple, and he was able to buy his way into this runoff.
I will say,
but he also probably crowded out a lot of Democrat advertising.
Yeah, I mean, Jason Estevez, you would have thought, given him really only being in an Atlanta area, might have helped him with name recognition. But I mean, I will say, I even hear it from people who are not either particularly political or maybe lean more conservative. A lot of complaints down south about these Rick Jackson ads. They're very, very tired of them.
Interesting. It's interesting. Well, we will have to wait until the June 16th runoff here in Georgia to see the results of that primary for the governorship and the other primary for the Republican Senate candidate. But either way, when it comes down to it, and
I think we know who the Senate candidate is going to be. I think it's going to be Mike Collins.
It's going to be Mike Collins.
Pretty bad candidate.
Yeah.
I mean, they're all bad candidates, but like at least Mike Collins is a congressman. So like, I mean, you know.
Well, I feel like they're all pretty interchangeable when it comes to who their opponents, who the Democrats' opponents are going to be in November here.
I agree.
They're all pretty interchangeable.
I think John's or Senator Ossoff is quite popular, even among people who would like maybe used to vote Republican and vote independent now because of Trump. You know, I mean, my brother-in-law's, you know, relatively conservative libertarian, and he likes Ossoff. He's met him through work and had really good positive things to say. And so I don't know. I'm very optimistic about that race.
Yeah, me too. Ossoff seems really safe, and I think he has embraced Keisha Lance Bottoms and try and promote her as well. And I think he's doing the right thing by that. I think he's going to win. I think he can get Keisha over the line in November.
I hope so.
You know, and I think it is people like your brother-in-law. There's an element of persuasion, but especially with inflation and the economics of what we're going through right now, I think there's a lot of Republican voters who just won't show up.
Well, I mean, I hope so. I mean, it's interesting. It's going to be, I mean, academically, it's going to be a very interesting primary. I hope it's not problematic in results, but I mean, you're seeing all these Trump candidates win.
Yeah.
And some beat incumbents all over the country. And so there's a lot of reason to think that is good for us and bad for them. But, you know, every time with Trump, you know, it's not the same as we've seen before. So, you know, it needs to be these people, we can laugh at them and call them jokes, but we need to take the race seriously.
Exactly. I couldn't agree more. Chris, I think we're going to have to end it there. All right, Chris, thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thank you.